All right, so let's finally get started. Hopefully everyone can hear me both online and in person through the mics. Sorry about that. We had a little technical trouble today, but we're back on track. I was going to give the long version of Robert's introduction. He provided, in typical Robert fashion, 3 versions: a short version, a shorter version, and the shortest version. The shortest version is, "Here's Bob," noting that he doesn't actually go by Bob. But so I'm not actually gonna go with that. I will do the medium length. For those that don't know, we're grateful to have Robert Mace here with us today. He's the Executive Director and Chief Water Policy Officer at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment. He's also a Professor of Practice in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Texas State University. Robert has over 30 years of experience in water resources and policy. He has a BS in geophysics and an MS in hydrology from the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology and a Ph.D. in hydrogeology from UT Austin. He published recently a book on groundwater sustainability in 2022 and is currently working on a book about water resources and climate change. And with that, I'm not going to say much more. Let's just get going. We're late. As always, hold questions till the end. I'll moderate. If you're online, drop your questions in the chat. Thanks, Robert. Take it away. Say something?
Hello?
Cool.
All right. So again, my pleasure to be here. So hydrohistory is a word. What? Oh, is a word that I made up, and I actually got into it during my career here at the Bureau of Economic Geology. I worked here in the 90s, and I worked on the superconducting super collider site. And one of my tasks was to create a groundwater flow model for the Trinity Aquifer, because the superconducting super collider, we're going to pump groundwater for cooling of the particle accelerator. And so we needed to do a model, and groundwater modeling, ideally you have development water level conditions to calibrate to. It just kind of removes one of the variables pumping over time, so you can do things in steady state. And as I was digging through the literature going back in time, I found myself reading reports from the late 1800s about Texas and measurements, and was just blown away at the quality of the work and the fact that you could find information, so far in the past. More recently, I've been doing, I did a work on Comanche Springs where, like hydrohistory is like another word for doing a damn good literature review. But with Comanche Springs, I actually was looking at using some of the tools that historians would use, like going through old newspaper accounts, because in that case, there wasn't good documentation of what happened early on, but I could go through, and it's easier these days with keywords, scan newspapers, find things. So in this case, this was hydrohistorical in the sense I wanted to understand the development of groundwater sustainability. And and what happened was I nearly got killed in an airplane leaving Albuquerque one time. And as I was contemplating my mortality, I was like, what life regrets do I have? One was like, wish I had more cats. And then, and then 2 was I really wanted to write a book. And I was like, damn it, if this plane goes down in flames, I'm not gonna be able to do that. Unfortunately, the plane did not go down in flames. And so it's been on my bucket list for a while. So that was a big reason for doing the book. And then also the opportunity fell in my lap. There's never a good time to write a book, I think, when you're really busy, because there was a publisher looking for someone to write about groundwater sustainability that asked a friend of mine, he had retired, and he's like, talk to Robert Mace, he'll write anything. And so I called up and I was like, oh man, I do not want to write a book, but man, this seems like a sweet deal. Sign me up. And of course, when you write a book, you have to write a proposal. And in doing that, you have to make a business argument for why you should write a book. The surprising thing was there was not a book out there dedicated to groundwater sustainability. There are a number of books about groundwater sustainability, but there are compendiums of different authors. And I know in my career, I always appreciated a single voice book that could explain everything very clearly to me. And so that was my goal with this book. And then I was thinking, how would I do this? And I thought, I'm going to read the literature forward in time. So I'm going to go back to the first paper report that introduced the concept of safe yield or sustainable management in groundwater, and I'm going to read everything going forward in time. I'm reading a book right now by Robert Caro, if you're familiar with him. He's the one that's writing LBJ's career in slower than real time. He writes those giant 1,000-page books about LBJ, and he talked about an editor early in his career that told him, turn every page, assume nothing, turn every goddamn page. So that's what I did. I just tried to find everything and read it all so I could kind of relive the experience of the development. And that turned out to be brilliant. I mean, I stumbled into it because I was thinking, well, how do I do this? Rather than just kind of randomly looking at stuff. Turned out to be brilliant because I could see how the concepts develop. And there's lots of controversy with groundwater sustainability, both on the policy side, but also definitionally amongst scientists. I could see how the terminology concepts developed over time and how, like, some of the fights we're still having today over terminology and the concept relate. And in fact, the fights we're having today, in my opinion, over the concepts and the terminology are false fights, because if you understood the history, you realize we're arguing about nothing. So that's what I'm going to talk to you all about. I lost all my, you saw all my slides already, so this joke isn't going to work. I lost all my slides, so I'm just going to show you photos of my cats today. But April Fool's, because it is April 1st today. I did wind up getting more cats after that plane event. Okay, so yeah, this is the book, and then there's a compendium report I worked on at the same time that's focused on Texas. So I wrote the proposal. If any of y'all are interested in writing a book, so the process is you write a proposal, got reviewed by like 5 reviewers, looked at the proposal, and and the editors got back to me, and they're just like, yeah, address the comments in here. Don't worry about reviewer number 2. Holy moly, reviewer number 2 is a doozy. It was an angry, seething angry review. And, sometimes laugh out loud, over the top angry. There was some good points. I mean, I read the whole thing, because they're like, don't even read it. And I'm just like, well, I read the whole thing. And, but it was clear to me the author of these comments was angry. He, assuming it was a he, and it was, turned out to be, was upset he wasn't writing the book. But also, there's also kind of this historical assumption of how Texas manages groundwater. And there was like a comment, I don't know that he intended me to see it, it would have been more appropriate for the editor, but his comment was, this is too important of a book to entrust to a Texan. And I'll talk about why that is. We do not have a good reputation in Texas on managing groundwater. And that's unfair. Most people assume it's all rule of capture, you can do whatever you want, but that's not the case. And then, to this dude's credit, when the book was finished, or I finished the first draft, it went back to those reviewers to review. And he hated my idea about reading the literature forward in time and all this stuff, but he came back and he goes, okay, I get it now. And then he dropped enough hints because he was upset I hadn't referenced enough of his stuff. Okay, you can get this on Amazon. I checked this morning. There's only 1 copy left, $99. And not bad. I'm ranked 2,950,765. So if I'd have named it 50 Shades of Gray Water, maybe it'd been top 10. I don't know. So outline, just briefly want to set the stage. We'll talk about the birth and growth of safe yield as a concept. The dismal march of the economists. I promised I'd make fun of economists, so I'll do a little bit of that. And then just some random thoughts about issues that have popped up over time in the literature about terminology and things like that. So setting the stage, it was engineers that really kind of set the terminology initially. And it was engineers working for the US Geological Survey. And so the old timers in the crowd probably recognize this, right? Reservoir Dogs, Quentin Tarantino. And so a lot of this surface water engineering terminology moved into the groundwater world. So basin, reservoir, firm yield, and safe yield. Now, if you're not familiar with these terms, these are terms that have been used and are used today in managing surface water and river resources, particularly in the West. The East, they feel like they've got plenty of stream flow, although that's changing. For the West, we mostly have prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, in regulating surface water, and then also we have to be concerned that we don't always get the rainfall that we need to keep the rivers flowing and the lakes full. And so the engineers do an analysis of calculating a firm yield. So in Texas, we use the term firm yield. So like Highland Lakes has a number associated with those lakes that says, here's how much you can take out every year and not go dry during a repeat of the drought of record. So in that case, it's a sustainable supply as long as we don't have a drought worse than the drought of record. Some other states, in fact, more commonly, what we refer to in Texas as firm yield is referred to as safe yield. In Texas, safe yield is firm yield with added time on the end to build a safety factor. But broadly, it's across the country, the term is really safe yield. And so in the groundwater world, that term got ported over into groundwater management. Just want to note some things that, well, first off, it's like groundwater reservoirs are much different than surface water reservoirs. I don't commonly use reservoir as a term. I prefer to use aquifers for groundwater resources, but groundwater reservoirs are different than surface water reservoirs. And it creates something I call the paradox of groundwater availability, where it's kind of like the golden goose in a way. It's like there's the golden goose that's laying the golden eggs, and you're getting an egg a day maybe. Of course, these days maybe just regular eggs. They don't need to be golden. You get an egg a day, and you're just like, I want more eggs, And so then you go for the goose. So it's kind of the paradox of groundwater availability. There's a huge amount of water in storage, but if you want to manage it sustainably, you can only pull a little bit off of it. Another way of looking at it is like you've got a corpus of funds and an endowment, right? The Jackson endowment, right? There's a bunch of money in that endowment, and then it's spinning off, in y'all's case, a lot of money. But sometimes you might be tempted to go after that corpus. And so groundwaters work like that. So most of the storage of fresh water in the world is in groundwater. That's what this is showing, unfrozen. So it's a little bit of a groundwater rose-colored glasses here, but 98.7% of all the fresh unfrozen water on Earth is stored in aquifers. However, the fluxes, there's a very small amount, 1%, according to this source, of all the rainfall that falls actually recharges the aquifer. So again, very little is coming in, but there's a huge amount in storage. Surface water is a bit of the opposite. There's a lot more water coming in, 38 times, but the storage is much smaller. The other background piece to know is that, for a very long time, humans were managing, I put in quotes, groundwater systems sustainably, in large parts because we could not pump or produce what we could produce until the technology came along, which was really through the invention of centrifugal pumps. And then ultimately it was like small enough pumps that could go down hole, and then you could get affordable energy to run those pumps. Is when we then started to be able to produce huge amounts of groundwater, which then started having consequences for the groundwater system, prompting people to start thinking about this. And it was the 1910s that we started getting downhole pump technology and affordable power to people to start pumping a lot of groundwater. So that led directly to the birth of Safe Yield. So that picture in the title and on the outline is Owens Valley, and that's where it started. This is like the first thoughts of managing groundwater outside of rule of capture, which rule of capture means do whatever you want, pump as much you want. It goes all the way back to Greco-Roman times. And so a fellow by the name of Lee, working for USGS, engineer, was looking at this basin, and this is also related to Los Angeles building a pipeline up there to get water, was like, okay, how do we manage this thing? Nobody's really thought about how to manage the groundwater system. I'm a surface water engineer. I've made calculations. I'm Lee now. I'm a surface water engineer, made calculations for safe yields on reservoirs. Seems like we should do the same thing with the groundwater system. So, so that's what he did. He then calculated that and had a definition, the limit to the quantity of water which can be withdrawn regularly and permanently without dangerous depletion of the storage reserve. I've made dangerous red here, blood red, and it's basically, it's like, what exactly is dangerous? You know, what does dangerous mean defined by an engineer or a scientist? And so he's very prescient in his definition, where he's got a technical component, but then there's this policy component that somebody needs to decide what does dangerous mean. This is key, and it's interesting. It started off with the very first definition of safe yield, but this is key in defining exactly what it is. There's a technical component, but there's also a policy component. And over time, people have forgotten that. Policy, you know, the science shouldn't change. I mean, the data and all things like that, but it's like the science is the science. But the policy really kind of depends on the mores of society and what people determine and decide is important going forward. This is interesting because he published a paper in a journal. It was an engineering journal, and it's a 71-page article. I don't think they let you do that anymore, do they? Texas Water Journal does. With 33 pages of comments from six authors. So like things were a bit more, I don't know, funner back then. It's like everybody and their third uncle commented on your paper. And the authors were pretty excited about it. You know, someone was saying, you know, Lee had restricted it to California basin style aquifers, but you know, one of the commenters was like, this could be used more broadly. I mean, this could be used for any aquifer. There was some comments on like how to maximize the yield. Like somebody noted, it was in part Mainzer. It's like, you know, there's discharge to swamps in the center of the basin, and you need to intercept that water before it comes out in order to optimize. O.H. Mainzer, he's known well by the hydrogeologists, he's one of the godfathers of hydrogeology, USGS engineer. Really liked it, and he was big back then, so that was like getting a blessing from the Pope that on your technical article. He also talked about well optimization. And then there's just some random dude from New York that, unrelated to the paper, just said groundwater sucks as a water resource, all the problems that they were having. So Mainzer then ran off with the concept and really promoted it. And then he defined, he put out one of these, maybe 1923, is like a list of hydrogeologic terms. He defined it as the practical rate of withdrawing water from an underground reservoir perennially for human use. So he made it very human-centric when he did this. And he also took out the dangerous component. But, you know, practical is also a mushy term. Although this is more probably engineering limitations more than anything. So there's a science component, and then he's made a policy decision, so to speak, by saying this water's for human use. C.F. Tolman in 1937, he's also a big name in historical hydrogeology. Yeah, he noted that there's cases where the aquifer may limit the production. May impact what the safe yield is. C.V. Tice put out an important paper in 1940 And he builds on Mainzer's 1932 explanation where he was describing when you pump a well, where does the water come from over time, and what is it affecting? So he was kind of relating that you pump, it's reaching out to recharge zones, it's intercepting water from springs and base flow from rivers and things like that. So he set the kind of the technical foundation for like what happens when you pump wells in an aquifer. Then over time, the concept developed. And so, again, production locations showed up with those comments. Somebody noted that you probably need to worry about water quality, because if you're pumping too hard on an aquifer and you're pulling in seawater from the coast, you're wrecking your aquifer. So we need to be thinking about water quality. Economics came in, which... But the economics here was that, what are the economics of producing water from certain depths? And that's, as Justin will tell you, it kind of depends on how deep your pockets are, which is why I'm like, I'm not, and it never really took off, where it's like you limit how much you produce from an aquifer based on economics as the economics change, as the technology changes. Consumptive use, this was somebody noticing that, for example, this is the case in Del City where farmers pump the groundwater to irrigate their crops, but then a chunk of that water infiltrates back down to the aquifer. So they've only consumed maybe 70% of what they're irrigating. So that should be factored in into the equation. Effects of groundwater rights in adjacent basins. So they weren't so concerned about like how my pumping might drain Ramon's well, but they're kind of concerned like basin here, basin there, how pumping might affect a neighboring basin or a neighboring aquifer. Todd, in 1959, in his hydrogeology textbook, has a pretty good definition in it. The amount of water which can be withdrawn from it annually without producing an undesired result. And there's that undesired result, the policy component, right? Scientists aren't good at figuring out what people want. And so, that's really a policy decision, not a technical thing. But, how much, like if you know what people don't want, then scientists and engineers can calculate how much you can pump to achieve that goal. Socioeconomics and welfare, social welfare popped up in Dominico in 1965 in terms of like, how pumping by one user might affect other users. Fetter was the first one to bring up the environment as a concern. He was looking at a small aquifer in Hawaii and was noticing that if they produced a safe yield as it was understood then, it would eliminate flows to the estuary, groundwater contributions to the estuary. So he's like, maybe we should be considering the environment in here. So again, there's like a timeline of enlightenment, assuming you agree with these different things. You might not give a rat's ass about bays and estuaries, but that's fine, because that's the complexity of policy. Policy there isn't a single answer to policy, but there should be, a single answer with error bars on the science side. So then folks started getting concerned, unhappy with the ambiguity. And this is really scientists and engineers not understanding that this is in part and largely, in fact, I would argue, it's largely a policy decision, not a scientific decision. Some of it's definitional. Somebody goes, what the hell's safe? Why is it called safe yield? And if we define safe yield, is it truly safe? Good point. If I was king of the world back then, I'd been like, we probably ought to call it something different than safe, because it's like, maybe it infers safety when there isn't any, but the name is stuck. Somebody said maybe we should call it perennial yield, which actually I like, but it just didn't take off. Then Thomas, in 51, engineer, he was just like, what the hell is this? Safe yield's an Alice in Wonderland term, which means whatever its user chooses. And he meant that in a derogatory way. Now, since I'm a scientist that's worked a lot in the policy realm, I'm like, I love the phrase, but it's like, that is true. Because the user is the policymaker, and it can be anything. It can be dry the springs, screw the neighbors, maximize production, or it could be, you know what, we want to keep Barton Springs flowing during a repeat of the drought of record. And we want to make sure we don't dry up people's household wells and the outcrop of the aquifer. There's no right or wrong answers there. You may feel like there's right or wrong answers, but in the playing field of policy, there's no right or wrong answers there. It's just like, what do the people want? What do the decision makers want? 51, someone's like, let's call it sustained yield. Then this, I call it the Kasman crisis. This is another engineer that weighed in on safe yield and sustainable yield. Still gets referenced quite a bit when people write about safe yield. This guy had no idea what he was talking about. If you read his stuff, he contradicts himself in different sections, but he basically was throwing a fit over the policy considerations. To me, again, since my career has been in the science policy world, I'm like, of course this is a policy decision. Science does not tell you whether an aquifer should be managed sustainably or not. And if you do manage it sustainably, science does not tell you at what level the springs should flow. Now, science can provide information to help you understand it. Like maybe you're concerned about salamanders. So what does the science say on how much, the minimum flow that salamanders need? And then a policymaker decides that's what they want to do, then that's what they can do. And this Kasman crisis stuff, this perception exists today. There's still folks that are like, what the hell, this doesn't make any sense. But policy doesn't make sense a lot of times. And it doesn't have to make sense, but it's invariably weaved deeply into this decision. Operating yield was another term, sustainable yield in 1970, aquifer yield, basin yield. All right, so let's talk about economists. And I do love economists, so I make fun of them, but I do love economists. So the dismal march of the economists. So 46 economists were like, this safe yield thing isn't working. And they were looking at the southern high plains of Texas, the Ogallala Aquifer, and the unsustainable production by Texas farmers in the Ogallala, which, those folks were pumping a heck of a lot more water than was being produced. Optimum yield was introduced in 51, which included safe yield, but also a mining yield. So in other words, planned depletion, which is fine. Try not to judge. 56, Milliman said producers have no incentive to maximize the present value of total extractions over time because he has no property rights which are valid in the future, so like tragedy of the commons. In other words, if the aquifer is being drained, there's no reason for me to not drain it also. Mining yield, optimal mining, optimal yield, again, a combined term. But kind of what I learned from this was standard economic analysis is now focused and literally discounts future benefits. And so, however, the way I'm wired, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around this. I'll give you an example. We have the Mace aquifer, and I keep lobbying the Texas State University for me to carry the Mace to carry the Mace into graduation. So I've got the feelers out there. We'll see. So the Mace aquifer, 100,000 megaliters in storage. Yeah, the editors of the book wouldn't let me use freedom units, so I had to use metric. Let's say the safe yield is 1 million megaliters per year. Let's say 1 megaliter is worth $1. The discount rate is 2%, and the aquifer is leaky. That's a hydrogeologic joke. Okay. Nobody ever gets it. Okay. It's a leaky aquifer. That's why I'm puffy down here. Okay. So drill, baby, drill. We are going to pump this sucker dry as quickly as we can. 5 million megaliters per year. Aquifer goes dry in 20 years. And based on the discount rate and using this Excel spreadsheet, I can calculate a net present value of $82 million. So now let's do it sustainably. We're going to limit pumping to 1 million megaliters per year, which we can pump forever. What's 1 million times forever? It's an infinite amount of water. It's an infinite amount of water. Does this water does it cost less or more? Does it have a net present value of less or more? It's less, $50 million. And the discount rate is, used to describe it as like inflation. It's not exactly inflation. It's more like where you invest your money. And so if you could invest your money in managing the aquifer sustainably, or you could invest your money somewhere else and you'd make 2% on top of inflation. Did I get that right? Approximately, yeah. So that kind of blows my mind, because I'm just like, well, wait a minute, oh, and then it's like 100 years, a megaliter water is worth, it's discounted to 14 cents. So it's just economists thinking a different way. And it kind of makes sense. It's almost as if it's on a lifetime scale. Like if I'm investing money, I don't give a crap at what Tesla stock is going to be worth in 150 years, because I'm going to be dead, right? So I'm gonna get out now. You make financial decisions based on now and how much time I have left, which is where that kind of now focused bit comes from. So there's this paper that came out in '92 by Jonas Salk that was probably one of the first questions of like, are we being good ancestors? Like, will people in the future look back at us and go, wow, those folks really had it all figured out, and they took care of us in the future? Or are they going to be like, what the holy hell were they thinking? Which is probably the latter. But there's this kind of conceptual thing. It's like, well, do we want to manage sustainably or not? One of the things I'm throwing in, this isn't historical, this is kind of my own thinking as I think about this, because I'm like, farmers don't call up their favorite economist to figure out if they're going to drill a well or not. And certainly not back then. They kind of came in just like, well, everyone else is drilling wells, and they're having great success with pumping, and I'm going to do the same thing. And more people do that, they do it. But there's no signaling from the aquifer that there's a problem until later. And that's part of that paradox. There's like so much water in storage, like the Ogallala, a massive amount of water in storage. The Ogallala is like 40% of all water supplies in Texas, surface and ground. Just a huge amount of water in there. But there's, for decades, there was no signaling back to the users that, hey, this isn't a good thing. There's a time component in there too. So it's like it takes decades for the signaling. It's like I should probably eat less Fritos. But someone told me, it's like you don't need to worry about that until you have your first heart attack. So that would be a strong signal that, okay, I probably need to change my diet. It's the same thing with aquifers, I think. So there's signaling in business information asymmetries. So it's like what do both parties know? Of course, there's signaling in biology. Hey, baby. And then, so I'm defining sustainability signaling. It's like actionable information from the environment to stakeholders, which is sufficient reason to take action. And then, unfortunately, like in the Ogallala, there's sufficient information coming from the environment back to the users, but they have so much sunk costs in what they've been doing that they're just continuing to do it. They're riding it all the way out. So. Another interesting thing that came up that was surprising to me was how long is forever. Did a little research. Average length of a marriage is United States is 8.2 years. Probably not a good metric. But for me, forever is needs to be indefinite. I mean, forever is forever. But there's like some folks that are like, well, you just define sustainability over a time frame, 30 years, 50 years. Problem with that is that if you optimize that, at the end of the 30-year, 50-year period, aquifer might be dry. And so you're really not managing it, in my opinion, sustainably. I put but adaptive because policy changes, science, develop better understanding. Kind of like the way Texas does desired future conditions in managing groundwater. There's a 5-year revisiting of the policy decisions to decide, is this what we really want to do in response to a number of features. Although there's very few desired future conditions in Texas groundwater that are sustainable. So some seemingly random stuff. There's a lot out there about the water budget myth. And this myth is that if we know what the recharge is, then we know the sustainable yield or the safe yield. And that is a concept that still perpetuates today, oftentimes by policymakers, but also by technical experts. So it's important to note, and there's been back and forth by these important people, but it's important to note that a safe, sustainable yield is almost never equal to recharge. This is an example, Trinity Aquifer, north of the Colorado River, so we're not talking hill country. It's a dipping aquifer. We have a recharge coming in, and there's a lot of discharge at the land surface, and then there's some water going deeper down dip in the aquifer. The big pumping is deeper down, like Dallas, Fort Worth, Waco. That's where the big pumping is because you have artesian pressure that helps to drive water to those wells. So according to groundwater modeling by Van Kelly and others at Interra, 1.76 million acre feet a year of recharge comes into this aquifer. 1.75 million acre feet per year comes out at the top, local intermediate flow. 14,000 acre feet in pre-development conditions goes down dip. So there's a number of people would say this is how much we can pump out down here. And this is a very dramatic example, but this also applies to the Carrizo-Wilcox. This also applies to the Gulf Coast aquifer and many other aquifers, particularly these dippers. And then note that you can increase that number, so because you're basically intercepting some of that recharge up there. Safe yield versus sustainable yield. There's stuff in the literature about some of it by Papadopoulos where it's like these are two different terms. They're the same damn term. Generally, people that are saying that this is different than this are like merging into that list of changes over time in the definition at not the right time. They're like, oh, 1950s, it was defined as this. How we define sustainable yield today is very different. They're very different things. But actually, safe yield is the same thing. It's the same thing as this. It's just now it has a different term for some people. And safe yield has evolved over time on the policy side of what things could be considered in the policy part of that equation. This will probably get me in trouble. Woke yield? So I'm just as woke as the next good liberal. So I'm not anti-woke, but there's kind of the current literature. There's a attempt to infuse the definition of sustainable yield with environmental justice and equity. I don't have a problem with that. And it should be in the policy side of the equation. They're trying to build it into the scientific side. So what they're saying is like, if you don't consider these things, an aquifer is not sustainable. By that definition, Barton Springs Aquifer is not managed sustainably, and the Edwards Aquifer Authority, or the Edwards Aquifer San Antonio segment, is not managed sustainably. That's ridiculous because they are for different reasons. So my argument is like aquifer doesn't give a damn about our politics or policy preferences. It's either being produced sustainably or not. And it's okay to involve those things, but it doesn't make sense to, my opinion, to bake those into the scientific definition. And when the book came out, those guys attacked me, which is fine, it's fun. And then finally, just a couple more slides here. In the book, I talk about sustainability pathways. So it's like, how do people arrive at managing sustainably if they choose to manage sustainably? De facto, it's like, we're just not pumping enough from the aquifer. So it's just nobody's doing anything except not pumping a whole bunch of water. So it's almost de facto sustainable. There's desire-driven. Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District, I put that under the desire, like there was a desire to preserve Barton Springs. I call it kind of love. It's love driven, but that doesn't work in an academic book. But it's desire driven. It's like we want to, the people actually want it to happen, so they make it happen. Legislatively forced, so some governing body is saying you have to do this. Court forced, so the court essentially forced the sustainable management of the Edwards Aquifer in the San Antonio segment, and then hydrologically forced. A real good example of this is the Leon area that feeds Comanche Springs. That system was being produced sustainably before there was any management, and that's because the sustainability signaling was on the order of years. And so the producers started going out of business at the fringes of that Robin system. And the word got out. It's like you don't want to drill over there because you're not going to have enough water. And so just naturally, in a way, restricted the pumping to one area, and then that's been sustainable ever since. There is a groundwater conservation district there. I should also note that there's a endangered species now also at Barton Springs that provides extra insurance in case there has to be court forced. So at the end of the day, I like this definition by Bill Alley. Development and use of groundwater in a manner that can be maintained for an indefinite time without causing unacceptable environmental, economic, and social consequences. So we've got the policy stuff there at the end, and the indefinite time and how much can be pumped in the beginning. Very similar actually to the definition that Lee came up with in 1915. I probably made a tactical error writing the book because I was like, I should come up with my own definition. And I didn't, because I couldn't come up with anything better than this, but I have regrets time. I'll be on my deathbed, damn it. Could have gotten referenced more. But it does require policy decision. You cannot force policy from groundwater sustainability. Sustainable yield is the amount that can be produced to achieve groundwater sustainability. Sustainable production is any production that can be done indefinitely, because there isn't a single value of sustainable yield, because it's defined by policy, and there's a whole spectrum of pumping you can do from no pumping up to some maximum level that's still sustainable. And then time needs to be indefinite but adaptive. Safe yield is the same as sustainable yield. So this is just this is a graph showing groundwater production from 0 to infinity. There's some maximum sustainable production independent of the yuckiness of policy. So scientists could go in and make some assumptions and calculate what's the maximum sustainable production. And here's the range of possible sustainable yields or safe yields. And then defined by policy, where do you want to be in that spectrum? So in conclusions, my conclusions will focus just on the hydrohistory. It's like I learned so much reading through the literature forward in time. Highly recommended. If you ever have an opportunity, it allowed me to just see. It's like, oh, here's this popped up and this popped up. Then this guy says all this smack about safe yield, but he clearly didn't read the literature that came before. And this is how this fits into this, and this fits into that. And then it's like, okay, I see it developing over time, and then it pops this new term, sustainable yield, which actually was proposed earlier, which is really the same thing. It's just part of the developing spectrum of the development of this concept that started in 1915. So we'll see. I don't know if anybody, you saw how well it's selling on Amazon. We'll see if it has any impact. So thank you so much for your attention. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Robert. Great talk. Yep. Oh, I've already got hands. So I just want to point out quickly, we did have 10 minutes of tech problems at the beginning there, but Robert was actually right on time. So with his talk time. So I know it's 10:55. People got to go. I understand. But hopefully some folks can stay and chat and have some Q&A. I personally could talk to Robert about this all day, but I won't hog it. So I've got a question here already.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. It's a great talk, and the book is fantastic, and I look forward to the paperback version.
Did you see that? You hear that? There is a paperback, although it costs more.
Oh, really?
Than the
Wow.
hard,
Okay, well, my question really speaks to, or I actually want to hear what your thoughts are on the terms of groundwater availability in studies in particular, because, you know, working in Central Texas, that seems like a real problem. You know, sustainability is not understood, you know, that a developer is forced, or the county forces somebody to go out and do an availability study, then they have this number, and then they go to the groundwater district and say, oh no, you know, so the system is kind of rigged for conflict, and then just that concept of groundwater availability, and then you kind of touched on it, over a certain time period, you know, is, I think, kind of creates a lot of conflict and misunderstanding out there, and just maybe want to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So first on kind of broad groundwater availability, which is which is like you saw those terms that combined mining aquifers with sustainability. That's kind of where water availability fits in. So groundwater availability could be sustainable development, could be planned depletion of aquifers, depending on the policy decisions made by the groundwater conservation districts that vote on those desired future conditions, their management goals. And so that's how that works. It does get updated every 5 years, so it's revisited, so it's adaptable in that sense. And again, very few, I mean, probably 95% of desired future conditions are not sustainable. That Texas report I put up there, like nobody's even talked about sustainability for the most part in Texas. So that study I put up there kind of helped people go, how do our goals and our current pumping fit with, you know, the best estimates of what might be the maximum sustainable pumping without a policy overlay. On the groundwater availability studies for like new plats, which was restricted to hill country, I think now it's statewide or can be statewide. So if a new developer comes in and they're relying on groundwater, the county may require them to do an analysis to show that they have enough water. And they, you know, there's several issues with that. Like one, they assume they're the only development in town, the only development over the aquifer. So there's no consideration of existing developments or future developments. And so because of that, and then also it's like, it's not tied to, I guess it's sustainable over 50 years. I think they require those now. It was 30 when they first started. So can it provide enough water for 50 years? But that doesn't mean it's truly sustainable. It's like, can you pump these wells and provide water? The other thing is those studies, study is too harsh of a word for what they're doing. They're terrible. I mean, when I was at the Water Development Board, we hired a consultant to kind of pull all those, because it's a lot of groundwater aquifer tests, which is hard to get. And then we're like looking at it, it's like, yikes. Glad I'm not the one sealing these reports as a PG. That answer your question? Yeah.
Because of the availability understanding at one level, and then, like you say, the sustainability and sort of a policy, and that comes in really at the end. And in my experience, that's really the problem. There's a lot of money and time and energy put into developing something, and then the idea of sustainability, it's kind of an afterthought when they go to the groundwater district again at the end of the process.
Yeah.
It's funny, worth noting, those groundwater availability studies are statewide now, except over the Carrizo-Wilcox. There you just get a pass.
That's right.
Anybody else question? Yes.
Robert, thank you. That was a great talk. Thank you. My question's about if the signaling for these systems is delayed, and just as if you imagine in the future, I went through looking at some springs that were dry, you know, the orifices weren't flowing. And so we're getting some signals that it's going out to a wider audience now with this drying. And I'm just wondering, for rebound or recovery for Texas aquifers, is there an idea about which ones could rebound and which ones might be more damaged over a longer period of time?
Just shooting from the hip, I think all of them could rebound, but some of them are going to take a lot longer to rebound. With the Ogallala, like one thing in the book is like I make it real clear I'm not taking a position on whether aquifers should be managed sustainably or not. It's like there could be a policy decision that we're going to bring the Ogallala aquifer back into sustainable management. But the economic consequences of doing that at this point are such that anybody that proposed that politically would be voted out of office and replaced with people that will allow the status quo to continue. So that's why I'm like, we're just going to ride it all out. I mean, farmers have already been going out of business for decades. It's a creeping disaster. The high plains are going to look very different in 30 years, which is pretty much when irrigated agriculture South Amarillo is going to be done at that point. But and those people at this point, they understand that, the farmers. I'm not going to say all of them do. I'm sure there's still many of them in denial, but they see their water levels going up. They actually get tax write-offs from the federal government on their depletion, so they know they're depleting. So even if you know the consequences, you still might not choose to do things sustainably. In Comanche Springs or out by Fort Stockton, that was soon enough. Like it was like within 3 to 5 years, that farmers that had just drilled wells were going out of business. And so that's a bit more. It's like one thing to like put in wells, and then it's like, I don't know, 50 years later, farms drying up, blowing away, versus you just put all this money, got a loan from the bank, and the wells were dry in 3 years. So that's stronger signaling than the Ogallala. And this is a worldwide issue. Many aquifers across the planet are not managed sustainably, and I think in large part it's because the slow signaling, and then there's also needs, like to grow food.
Then you get back into that economics, right, and some cost fallacies and all these other issues. But yeah, great question. I've got one quickly online. I've got to get this one out here from Marcus. Other than the Edwards, which Texas aquifer is managed the most sustainably? Other than the Edwards.
So the Bone Spring Victoria Peak, another karst aquifer, Del City area is managed sustainably. There's the Lipan aquifer, which is a highly permeable sediments, unconsolidated sediments from the Edwards Plateau. That one's managed sustainably in the sense that they almost pump it dry every year, then it fills back up and pump it dry. So they maybe it's serial depletion rather than sustainable production.
Well, that goes back to your point in the presentation about this concept of sustainability based on recharge. Right? So that would be potentially a sustainability based on recharge. You can just dry it.
That's excellent point. Yeah, and those farmers have learned that, okay, well, this is what we can get. That's what we get, and that's how they've optimized farming to that supply. Subsidence districts have, it's not the aquifer as a whole, but the subsidence districts are managing sustainably because of the undesired effect of land subsidence.
The land slipping into the ocean is generally bad.
Yes.
Well, good question. Thank you, Marcus. Yes, unless drought changes that. That's a good point. That recharge changes under drought. Yeah. Anybody else? Last questions? Like I said, I personally could talk about this all day, but I know we're 5 past time if folks have to go, but welcome to sit and chat for a while if not. Okay, cool. Well, that's, wait. Well, can we attribute woke yield to Robert Mace?
Sure.
I vote yes. Oh, yes. All right, thanks, everyone.
Yeah,